Hi, Elise Dewsberry here from New Musicals Inc. And I'm starting the 6th year of my monthly video blog, How to Get No Feedback from Elise. And I thought that for the first few months of this year, that I would revisit some old topics that I may have touched on in the past, but I've had just a handful of new thoughts about them and wanted to share a few extra things. So the first one that I'm going to be revisiting for this month is transitions. So when I talk about transitions, I mean literally how you get from one scene to the next when you're writing your musical. And I often give people a lot of feedback about transitions because I've been finding that there are many people out there writing musicals who still tend to write their scenes as if they're in a more old-fashioned style of musical production than I think we have today. So, back in the old days, you'd have a scene, and when the scene ended, the lights would go down and it would be dark for a second. Maybe we'd hear a little shuffling around, maybe there'd be a little transitional music, and eventually when the lights came up, we'd be in a new scene. And by then, the furniture will have been moved, and the actors, if they need to be in the next scene and it's a different time or something, they might have been able to do a quick change or something like that. And that was very common. Sometimes people would chat during the transition, or you'd check your program to see how many songs were left in the act and how long you had to wait till intermission, et cetera, et cetera. But that really is not how things are produced these days. I often, this is a slight sidebar, but I often also see people mention, when the curtain rises. Well, the fact of the matter is there are still places where that kind of theater is being done. But in general, most people who are producing shows these days, there, generally speaking, isn't a curtain. Some theaters still have curtains, but many don't or don't use them. But more to the point, transitions are much more fluid and much more cinematic than they used to be. And usually what's going to happen is while one scene is ending, the next scene is starting. And there's very little gap in between. Sometimes, the lights will come down on one scene as they're rising on another part of the stage, so that there's a continual flow that doesn't stop and remains very cinematic and very, very fluid. Now, here's what that means to you if you're writing a musical. How can you make sure that your transitions can be fluid? So if you think about it, what you want to do, I think, is go through anything that you're writing or outlining or working on and look at what happens at the very end of a scene, who's on stage, and then who needs to be on stage at the beginning of the next scene. So if your lead character is at the very end of a scene, and then they're meant to be at the top of the next scene, but it's 3 days later, and they're in a different location. So that means, in the old days, the lights would go down, your actor would run off stage and do a quick change while they changed the furniture, and then your actor would come back on stage and the lights come up, and it would be, the character would be in a different outfit in a different set. But if you want to write a show that's fluid, I think you need to be looking very carefully at what I would refer to as a buffer, a scene buffer, right? So if that's what you want, if your main character needs to be at the end of one scene and at the top of the next scene, there's going to have been a passage of time, a new location, new costume. I think you need to write a buffer that happens either at the end of the scene or at the beginning of the next. So in other words, you need to take the character who needs to appear in the next scene and get them out of the scene a little bit early and find a way to continue the scene a little bit after they've gone with a couple of other characters, to literally give that character time to exit. And I'm talking just logistically, the actor is going to exit the stage, run around backstage while their dresser is chasing them and getting them changed, come around to the other side of the stage and be ready to come on stage and be sitting on a set where the lights are going to come up on the other side, so that when the characters you've left behind in this scene finally finish, we're talking, a few lines of dialogue, because these things can happen pretty quickly. The lights go down and then the lights come up on the other side, and lo and behold, our character has already made it over there in their new clothes onto the new set. So that would be a buffer at the end of the scene. The other way to do it is to put a buffer at the top of the next scene. So your character is at the end of this scene, or maybe there's a couple of characters that have to make this transition, and the lights come down. Then the lights come up on the other side, and there's a buffer at the top of that scene. There's something else happening, between a couple of other characters, giving your actor or actors time to get around stage, change clothes if necessary, and then make an entrance. They would make an entrance then. So they either have to make an exit early or make an entrance a little bit later. And that would allow your production team to create these more fluid transitions. So I think that's something to think about. There is another way to do fluid transitions where you literally have your character simply walk from one scene to another, and we never lose them. I think that can be very cool, but I do think that that needs to be something that you incorporate throughout the piece. It needs to be a consistent device that you're using. You can't just do it in one scene because it would be useful and then not do it in others. I think if we're following the lead actor from scene to scene, and maybe they're talking to us in between, or they're on the phone in between scenes, but we never actually lose them. They're always lit, and the scene is configuring around them as they move. But I think that's a decision you need to make throughout. I think these are very important things to be thinking about while you're writing your musical, to make sure that you're writing something that is producible, that it's possible to make these scenes happen without forcing your production team to have the lights come down and people sit and wait until the lights come back up. So that's the way I feel about transitions in the modern day of cinematic musical theater production. So check your musicals, make sure that you're making those kinds of transitions possible. And then you won't find me pestering you about them when you send them in for feedback. Thanks, and bye-bye.